Good afternoon, everyone. This is Richard Gupton with the Agricultural Retailers Association. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We're going to start here about 1 minute after, just giving attendees times to log in before the webinar. So again, appreciate you taking time this afternoon, and thank you to our presenters as well. We're going to, again, those that are just logging in, we plan to start the webinar here in the 1 minute after, just give folks time so they're logging in. Hello, and welcome to this ARA webinar with staff from the Conservation Technology Information Center, the American Seed Trade Association, and the Center for Regenerative Agriculture at the University of Missouri, and NCR SARE Regional Director of Extension Programs. Today's webinar will focus on the National Cover Crop Survey Report. The goal of this webinar is to amplify the data collected in the 2023 Cover Crop Survey and open lines of discussion between ag retailers and researchers on the benefit of cover crops and their efficacy. My name is Richard Gupton, Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Counsel with ARA, and I'll introduce our webinar speakers in a bit. But first, I'll go over a few things so you know what to expect. First, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Webinars are an important part of the ARA professional development pathway and provide a great opportunity for ARA members, companies to help educate their employees. You can learn more about these development programs at aradc.org under the Professional Development tab. Questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation, but you can type them into the chat panel or the Q&A panel at any time. Today's webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be added to the members-only section of the ARA website. As a reminder, you can log into the member-only ARA dashboard to access past webinar recordings. And if you're not having a login, you can email info@aradc.org to set one up. So with that out of the way, I'm excited to introduce our speakers, Ryan Heiniger, Executive Director of the Conservation Technology Information Center, Andy Lavigne, President and CEO of the American Seed Trade Association, and Rob Myers, Director of the Center for Regenerative Agriculture at the University of Missouri and Regional Director for Extension Programs for the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture, North Central Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. Ryan Heiniger is the Executive Director of the CTIC, a 42-year-old member-based nonprofit focused on accelerating conservation, agricultural practice, and technology adoption. Ryan is a fourth-generation farmer in the Southeast Iowa on a corn and soybean farm near the Mississippi River and has implemented cover crops, pollinator, riparian buffer habitat, and other conservation practices. Prior to joining CTIC, Ryan worked for Farm Journal, Ducks Unlimited, and Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever in a number of leadership capacities. Ryan has a bachelor's degree in wildlife biology from Iowa State University. Andy Lavigne is currently the president and CEO of the American Seed Trade Association. He joined ASTA in February 2006. Andy has had a 30-year career in government relations, industry representation, public affairs advocacy, and management. His core areas of expertise include agriculture, food policy, and international trade. Prior to joining ASTA, Andy was executive vice president, CEO of the Florida Citrus Mutual, representing citrus growers on issues affecting their business. Previous to joining Florida Citrus Mutual, Andy spent 4 years at the Florida Fertilizer and Agrochemical Association as president and executive director. FFAA is a nonprofit agricultural trade organization representing companies that specialize in crop protection and plant nutrition products. Before his position at FFAA, Andy spent 8 years in Washington, D.C., working in the U.S. Congress and U.S. Department of Agriculture. He served as legislative director for Congressman Charles Kennedy, Agriculture Committee staffer from Congressman Tom Lewis, and on the staff of USDA Secretary Ed Madigan. Andy is a native of Florida with a BA degree in political science with a minor in economics from the University of Florida. Rob Myers is director of the University of Missouri Center for Regenerative Agriculture and a professor of plant sciences. He also serves as regional director of extension programs for USDA NIFA North Central Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. Over half of his 140 publications are on the topic of cover crops, including a new cover crop book he released last fall for farmers and farm advisors entitled Cover Crops, Improving Life on the Land. He grew up on a family grain farm in central Illinois and is still involved in management of that family farm, which is 100% cover cropped. His PhD and MS degrees in agronomy are from the University of Minnesota. You'll also be able to scan a QR code at the conclusion of the webinar and receive CEU credits for sustainability, 0.5 credits, and soil and water management, 0.5 credits, towards your Certified Crop Advisor certification. I will now turn it over to Andy Lavigne.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to the ARA team and ARA members who are joining us today to give us the opportunity to present this 7th survey of the National Cover Crop Survey between SARE, CTIC, and ASTA. It's a great opportunity as we look at the issues before us in agriculture and incentives on sustainability and soil health and all of the other issues facing us. I think this is a fantastic opportunity to talk about the benefits, but also talk about where the ag retailer community can play a role in providing information as well as cover crop seed mixes. You know, we all realize the benefits of cover crops as an important tool for soil health and retention. They support the overall sustainability efforts of growers and livestock producers across the country. And they also play a vital role in supporting farmers' economic livelihood and productivity. As farmers continue to embrace cover crops as an important tool in sustainability activities and practices, it's vital that the seed industry continues to innovate and develop new and better cover crop varieties to meet that demand. And our companies are doing that in collaboration with our land grant institution and research institutions like CTIC, and SARE, Rob's group. So we look forward to continuing that relationship between the private and the public sector and working with the state organizations. The important part is understanding that cover crop program, the acreage goals over the short and long term that will help the industry plan ahead, the seed industry that is. It's, as we all know, seed's not produced overnight. You have to plan ahead. You've got to plan several years in advance. And oftentimes, seed producers are forced to try and estimate what that future need is going to be. So that relationship between ag retailers and seed companies is absolutely vital. Recently, ASTA did a survey with the Partnerships for Climate Smart Agriculture, or commodities, which is part of the monies in the Inflation Reduction Act. And we looked at all of the studies that were being done and projects that will be performed, and 88 out of the 123 projects that were awarded funds had cover crop components to them. We anticipate at least 10.5 million acres over the next 5 years will be added to the current acreage of cover crops that are out across the U.S. So we see a lot of incentives out there, and I think a lot of farmers are analyzing where they want to bring more cover crops into their production practices. At ASTA, we've helped produce a resource that lists the seed companies across the country and provides that opportunity for you to look at it, for your customers to look at where seed companies may be that are selling cover crop seeds and providing planting resources. You just need to go to betterseed.org and under resources, go drop down, and there'll be a reference to the cover crop map. Take a look at that and let us know if you have any questions on that. We really do appreciate the relationship that we have with SARE and CTIC and ARA on this, as well as NRCS and other organizations promoting the use of cover crops, and look forward to the rest of this presentation. And with that, I'm going to toss it over to Ryan Heiniger. Ryan, it's all yours.
And thank you, ARA, for hosting this. Great to bring the survey results back to life, as our cover crops throughout Iowa, I know here in the southeast part of the state, have come back to life here in the last couple of weeks with the warm weather and the rainfall. And I just want to quickly, double down on this great work that the American Seed Trade Association just released last week. A lot of farmers that I talked to just still have not heard about these amazing opportunities that are coming through all the partnerships for climate smart commodities. And so if you're an agronomist, if you're a farmer dialing in, take a look at all these programs that are available in your state. Next slide. So jumping right into the 2022-23 survey results, we added several new sections for last year that ranged from cover crop grazing. Of course, carbon programs still have a lot of questions, and farmers are researching to better understand how that may add some additional revenue to their bottom line. In total, the survey reached 795 farmers. Just about a year ago, it was live on the street. 80% of the responses came from cover crop users, but importantly, the survey results also contain data points, roughly 8% from farmers who previously used cover crops, but then had stopped sometime prior to 2022, as well as 11% of the nearly 800 farmers have never adopted cover crops. Next slide. As you might predict, there's a heavy emphasis across the Corn Belt, and Iowa, I think, leading the charge at just shy of 100 responses. But amazingly, even 2 farmers in Alaska, 5 in Hawaii also took the time to help give us great insights. We also had a little bit deeper response from the horticulture section this year, and the only state that did not have a farmer response was New Hampshire. They're in the Northeast, but again, very strong concentration across the I-states and the larger Corn Belt, as you might imagine. Next slide. And again, probably nothing earth-shattering here, that the average farmer response age is 59, very closely mirroring what we see time and time again with the NASS survey from USDA. I think just maybe a year or a year and a half younger than that, but a great age distribution. And I don't know about you all, but I would love to meet the farmers in the 80 to 85 plus category that were, taking time out of their schedule, still dialed into the farm and providing great feedback, whether they were a cover crop user or not. We appreciate everybody that did take the time to give us the feedback for this year's survey. Next slide. Something I'm really proud of with the results as they turned out was just this great distribution across farms of all sizes. As you can see, from 1 to 9, that might have been an urban farm, might have been a little bit on the smaller hobby farm, even all the way up to 2,000 acres and larger. I think some 44% do represent farm sizes of the 500 to 2,000 plus. But again, the feedback really does come from across a broad cross-section of farmers and farm sizes. Next slide. And again, with the farmer responses and their own background, their own demographic, if you will, 50% nearly do represent commodity farms, but 22% again from that horticulture sector, and nearly 10% representing just livestock only, and then a combination of both commodity and livestock, and you can see the categories there. But keep this in mind as you're thinking about the responses that we'll get into more detail here in a moment. Next slide. Land ownership and cover crops. This is kind of one of the fun takeaways. in that it's a common belief, sometimes even a myth, that if you rent land, that due to any number of factors, whether it's just an annual lease or other stipulations, that it makes it more challenging, if not impossible, to adopt cover crops. And this data point starts to debunk that myth just a little bit, in that if you look at that very first bar at the top, some 14% of cover crop users own zero of the land that they farm, which is actually about 4.5 percentage points higher than the non-users. And then if you go to the other side of the spectrum, if they own 100% of the farm, of the land that they farm, it's nearly neck and neck with 33, 34%. But that first couple slides really, I think, are some of the key takeaways, that if you own less than the majority of the acres that you farm, they're still finding a way, through grit, through determination, through whatever the means necessary, to have cover crops applied to those rented acres. Next slide, please. This is also some of the fascinating data points, where if you go to our website, and I'll drop the link in the chat later, where all the years of cover crop surveys, as Andy alluded to, we've done 7 now, are on the CTIC website, and I'll put that link in there. And so this, as you might imagine, has changed over the decade that we've been doing the survey, where today some 40% of the farmers that do use cover crops have what I would call, a bachelor's degree, a master's, and a PhD in cover crop use. And so a tremendous wealth of information and knowledge, I'm sure, learned through both trial and error on their operations through a variety of climatic conditions and crop rotations. But 40% of users today have 10 plus years of experience, which I think also can be a key factor going forward to further lean into tapping that expertise to help their other neighbors. And of course, some states like Wisconsin do a variety of programs through peer-to-peer learning programs. And of course, CCAs and others play an instrumental role in helping with that knowledge transfer to beginning farmers. Next slide. So getting a little bit deeper here, no pun intended, into tillage, and whether that's continuous or reduced tillage or conventional tillage, and what are these trends? What do the data start to tell us here? So it's not quite a 2-to-1 margin, but as you can see with that first bar chart, by 48% to 29% of cover crop users to non-users, definitely leaning in the category of continuous no-till. But again, one of the other kind of myths that is out there is that cover crops don't have a place on farms that do use tillage. And as you can see at the very bottom there, some 9% of the responses came from farms that are still using conventional tillage, even though they have adopted cover crops. Next slide. So one of the things that we wanted to try to tease out and pull from the data point a little bit more is what are the trends on those farms, again, for the farmers that do have cover crops. And what you can see there is almost a break even between no change in the amount of tillage over time with cover crops, and then about the same number of farmers said they had significantly decreased tillage in their operation as a result of using cover crops. And I think this next slide will further showcase that. And it really is counterintuitive to me when I first saw the data come back from Rob and his team and started to dig into it deeper. This surprised me, quite honestly, in that, of course, anytime you're changing tillage practices, other management regimes need to be taken into consideration, and then layering on cover crops along with the transition to no-till is, of course, not just one more thing to take into account, but of course, many different facets of adding this growing live plants out in the field. And so the takeaway here really is that overwhelmingly, the farmers felt like including cover crops made the transition to no-till even easier for them. Maybe there's some questions from the audience here during the Q&A we could talk about, or have others share their own thoughts about this. Next slide. As you might imagine, each farmer has their own unique goals and objectives for using cover crops and transitioning for no-till. But again, the real takeaway here is soil health in some way or some fashion, whether that's looking at aggregate structure, just utilizing their soil moisture, perhaps getting rid of excess moisture, keeping the ground a little bit cooler so it locks in that moisture, whatever the case may be. But clearly, soil health was the predominant benefit that farmers were seeing from using cover crops. Next slide. One thing to point out that while we do have a great track record of this survey, we do not ask the same farmers year over year. And so, it's meant to be more of an index than it is to really take away that the trend applies to the farmers throughout all the different 7 surveys that have been done. And so, for example, in the 2019-2020 survey, the planting intentions revealed, I think, 465 acres that past year. So that was even slightly higher than the 413 acres of planted cover crops expressed by farmers in 2022. But one kind of call out here too is that the horticultural farmers and some of the smaller farmers probably brought this overall average down a little bit. But the thing that still is exciting that I think everybody is aware of is that the adoption is growing, and the trend line here is the positive thing, inching upward year over year. Next slide. So similar to that data from a moment ago with the benefits, the goals that they have for no-till. Here again, soil health, soil carbon, soil organic matter, reducing erosion, all top the list. I would do a call out for a couple of other things if you direct your attention about halfway down the list. Nearly 50% are using cover crops specifically to provide a boost for their nitrogen for the cash crop. And of course, I think also on the incentive side, we see that time and time again as an important element, but in terms of the primary or overarching goal, that doesn't make the top of the list. And I think also that very last category is worthy of mention too, that only nearly 2% were using cover crops specifically because their landlord was requiring it. Next slide. So I think I mentioned this earlier that one of the new areas that we wanted to dive deeper for this year was the specific practices and whether people were changing their herbicide programs, their nutrient and fertility programs before and after covers. And specifically, of course, corn is something that's been studied well. And I think a lot of farmers have learned through trial and error, again, what works for them. So we'll just jump right into specifically managing corn after cover crops. Next slide. Well, the 143 farmers that did indicate they are planting green. The other way to really look at this, if you consolidate those 3 first bars, 196 of the farmers are terminating anywhere from 2+ weeks to a week before they are planting their corn crop. And so I would encourage folks to really study that number and think about it in that sense of termination before versus planting green. And that, again, is 196 to the 143 farmers that are choosing to terminate early. Next slide. And of course, again, back to the nutrient and fertility aspects where 44% are making the extra effort to apply nitrogen at the time of planting. And then I would also put that 18% in that same category of farmers that have probably read the literature, talked to other farmers where they're further concerned about that nitrogen tie-up with the winter cereal, whether that's wheat or triticale or rye or other winter cereals, and they're just altogether foregoing including that in their mix before corn. Next slide. In terms of the methodology, the specific application, as you can see, no clear winner here. Really almost a complete mixed bag across all three categories for those farmers that are applying more nitrogen at the time of corn planting. So using the different tools and equipment, I'm sure that's available to them and very likely to their retailer as well. Next slide. Weed control, of course, is one of the benefits. If you think back to that past slide with the different goals, the different benefits that they've seen, clearly, in this case, 73% of the farmers felt like the weed control was getting better compared to only 2% of farmers felt like the weed pressure got worse using cover crops. So this is very encouraging to me. And as you'll see here in a couple slides, very, very similar numbers, inching just ever so slightly up for soybeans as well. Next slide. And I think this is also some of the pretty fascinating data that if you dig deep into the report, again, once you view it on our website and download it, this will be especially relevant to our ag retailer friends and agronomists, is that while some are definitely reporting some savings, a vast majority are not having really any impact to their budget for herbicide program for corn when using cover crops. Next slide. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, that again, it's inching up from 73% to nearly 75% of farmers reporting very significant weed control being better when using cover crops ahead of soybeans, and only, again, 2% felt like the weed control had gotten worse. Next slide. And finally here, again, very, very similar numbers and distribution with corn that while some definitely did see a savings, and whether they throttled back or changed chemistries, whatever the case is, a vast majority were not changing their budgeted costs and their expenditures for herbicides before soybeans. And I think that concludes my slides, so we'll turn it over to Rob. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. And I want to express my appreciation to both ASTA and CTIC for their long ongoing partnership with these surveys with the USDA Sustainable Ag Research and Education, or SARE program that I manage for the North Central region. So we want to kind of switch gears to the cover crop species and mixes, because we know in the ag retail community, a lot of you are selling cover crop seed to farmers, sometimes single species, in other cases, prepackaged mixes. And we appreciate the chance to visit with you today about this type of data and other topics. So with the species, one thing we've done with the survey for a number of years is to ask which species people are planting. And keep in mind, this is both row crop farmers and horticulture, but as you'd expect, cereal rye by far leads the way. The other takeaway, though, I think, is that there are many, many species clearly that farmers are planting. In fact, there's over 40 species of cover crops on the market. So as you think about your work as an ag retailer with the farmers, keep in mind they do have a lot of choices, many of those through your own organization. And I think part of our challenge, those of us that advise farmers, is to help them navigate what's kind of a complex topic. If we go out and plant corn or soybeans, it's pretty straightforward. You've got those two choices, or other commodities such as cotton, but here there's a lot of choices. And I think helping the farmers identify what's going to work for them is an important part of what ag retail community does, consulting agronomists and others. Next. Mixes are definitely popular today, and one thing we clearly see from the survey is that the more farmers use mixes, the more they increase over time. You can see that 65% of the farmers, that green part of the pie chart, were planting mixes and plan to stick with them. Now, we have 18% that have not used mixes, and we tend to find that that's the farmers usually with less experience with the cover crops. Next slide. The number of species used in a mix is pretty variable. Typically, those that are fall planting cover crops are to the left side of this chart, 2, 3, maybe 4 to 5 species. If they're doing a summer cover crop mix, such as after a small grain or early season vegetable, that's where we get those more complex mixes typically, potentially 8 or more species even. Next. And when we look at the species that are used in a mix, it's similar pattern to earlier. Now, rye kind of comes back into the field a little bit because obviously with mixes, there are a lot of other things being used. Again, the takeaway, I think, is just lots of different species that are getting acceptance in various mixes as we look at different uses across the farming area of the U.S. Next. And as I mentioned earlier, that change in diversity over time, the green slice here, 45% are increasing the number of species that they're using in the mixes. About 45% are holding steady. In other words, if they've been using 2 or 3 species, they're sticking with that. Relatively small number, just under 9%, are decreasing the number of species. So in general, that trend is to more diversity over time. Next. Now, a big question we always get about cover crop impacts is what is it going to do to the yields? And for every year that we've done this survey, we've asked farmers about their yield experience. And the way we ask that question is, if you have fields both with cover crops and some fields without that otherwise have similar soils and similar management, please give us your yield data. And typically that's about a fourth of the farmers responding to the survey because some are 100% cover crop, others don't have equivalent management situations. But we think it's a pretty good data set. We've had 200 to 500 farmers a year giving us yield data. And as you can see in this particular figure from our most recent survey, there's variable results. It's kind of what you'd expect. There's some farmers that had yield losses, or some fields, I should say, and other fields where there were pretty big gains. But on average, those gains are somewhat modest. And the other thing you see here is the more consecutive years of cover cropping, the more that trend line is upward. Next slide. In fact, when we look at the number of years of experience of cover cropping on yields, if we just separated out those farmers with 10 or more years of cover crop experience, Ryan talked about how that was over 40% of the farmers. Pretty strong statistically different yields there, 6.3% on soybeans and close to that on corn. Contrast that with the farmers who had 2 years or less of cover crop experience, still a statistically significant yield difference in soybeans, but more modest at 3.3%. And corn in this year was not statistically different. And in most years we've done the survey, the corn yields have been 2 to 3% better on average, soybeans more like 3 to 5% better. But again, the more years of experience, the bigger that yield advantage is. Next. Now, cover crop planting approach is something we get questions about as well. And this is another area where the ag retail community comes into play. So certainly the majority of situations, the farmer is primarily planting themselves, but we do have quite a few that are using companies to do seeding for them. In some cases, an aerial applicator. Others are hiring an ag retailer. I want to stress this is where farmers are asked, what's your primary method? I have talked to many large farmers and they will tell me, well, I drill the majority of my cover crops myself, but I do hire an ag retailer to put on some with my fertilizer or maybe an aerial applicator. So keep in mind the percentage of ag retail role is bigger here, and it's certainly growing. That's something we're seeing as well. Next. And cover crop seeding method, here again, we see a variety of approaches. While drill is a pretty common approach, we see a lot of broadcasting. That could include broadcasting by an ag retailer. Aerial applications still popular at 12%, but not as common as some of these other approaches. And so certainly we're seeing ag retailers broadcast cover crop seed with or without fertilizer, providing that type of service. Next. The timing of cover crop planting has kind of been changing over time. It used to be that nearly everyone planted their cover crop after their cash crop was harvested. Increasingly, we're seeing more farmers trying to get that cover crop growing earlier. They want to get more benefit from it. So some are broadcasting it into that standing crop, particularly corn, but sometimes soybeans or other crops. They could be doing that again with an airplane, with a high clearance spreader, such as through their ag retailer. This year, we saw for the first time some significant use of drones in some area, and I think we're going to see more use of that. That may be an opportunity for ag retailers just to offer that type of service, drone seeding of cover crops. And then we have some that will go even earlier in the year, maybe with a high clearance drill when the corn is knee high, for example, and a few are frost seeding even earlier in the year. So a diversity of approaches. Next. Termination method, obviously ag retailers very involved in termination of cover crops. Now keep in mind, this includes horticulture users, which are about 20% of the audience. So if you looked at the row crop users, clearly most of them, if they have something overwintering or using a herbicide, if they have horticultural crops, that's where you're going to see the mowing or tilling approaches. Now, both types of farmers, both row crop and horticulture, are making use of roller crimper. You can see about 5% are saying they usually do that, and then another 13% sometimes do that. And then we see some other approaches like very small scale horticulture users will take a tarp out. We're talking people with urban gardens or things like that. Next. Planting green. Ryan mentioned this earlier. Again, a decade ago when we first did our first survey, not a lot of use of planting green there, but this practice has really taken off. And of course, planting green just simply means planting into a still living green cover crop and then terminating after planting the cash crop. So it could be done when the cover crop is a few inches tall to up to 5 or 6 feet tall, like you see in the lower right there. Next one. So what is being planted green? Well, primarily soybeans, often into cereal rye or other winter cereals. About 58% of farmers were using that approach. Corn is fairly popular, and farmers could choose more than one response here. So you see some other, but those are the two main crops we're seeing planted green. Next slide. The extent of planting green is interesting to see. So clearly, there are some farmers that have gone into that in a major way, planting most of their acres. You can see on that far right chart with 85 respondents. But we've also got folks at the other end of the spectrum that are still kind of testing it out, doing it on a few fields. And I always tell farmers, if you're thinking about doing planting green, start with just a field or two to get some experience. I don't advocate jumping into this right away without getting some experience, but definitely getting more common. Next. And part of the reason it's getting more common is farmers are finding it works for them. We asked, how did you find this management experience? Well, the biggest number found that it was simpler, although an almost similar number found it was about the same level of complexity, but they're doing it because of the benefits. And there's another good chunk, 50 respondents, who said, well, it seems a little more difficult. Maybe they've got to change more planter settings, but the benefits seem to be worth it. Could be extra weed control or soil health benefits. There were a small number that found that it was not only more difficult, but they weren't sure that it was worth it. And a very small number said they were going to stop using planting green, but very minor number compared to the total. Next. Again, the reasons they're doing planter green are diverse, but weed control is clearly the most popular reason, along with those soil health benefits. Now, pest issues have been discussed a lot. Are they going to be worse or better in planting green? I think the jury's still out a little bit. It's going to depend on the area. We do see some places where voles can be worse with planting green, but there can be reasons to keeping it growing longer, such as with insects, that some of the insects, like say you've got armyworm, may keep eating the growing cover crop instead of moving over to the cash crop seedling. So again, weed control is the big benefit, but otherwise farmers are finding not a huge difference, all those orange bars in the middle for these other issues. Next. The impact on soil moisture is really the biggest question about planting green. And you can see here 67% said it helps with soil moisture management. I think that was a bit of a surprise to folks. There was an assumption that with planting green, well, you're going to dry out the soil, and that can happen. In fact, this most recent year, 2023, keep in mind the survey was done in the spring of 2023, but so it was before, I should say early spring, before we got into planting last year. It was too dry in many places to do planting green. So I always tell farmers, by all means, terminate early if we're having a dry spring. But in a typical year, if we are getting some rainfall, that extra cover crop growth can help manage that moisture. Others said it was kind of similar for them to their early termination, and only a small fraction, 7%, said they were experiencing the soils getting too dry. So interesting to see. Next. Let's switch over to the topic of cover crop incentives, because we're seeing more and more money from government and private sector sources for incentives. So lots of questions about this. We found among our respondents that 72% had actually never received a cover crop payment. But for those that had, the NRCS programs are popular, both the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and Conservation Stewardship Program. Some have had crop insurance rebates, some have received money through state programs, and some through private company payments. Now, I expect that private company payments to keep growing given the number of companies that have started offering opportunities there. Next. For those that did get a payment, now keep in mind, this is just the fraction that did receive a payment, not those that said they hadn't. Where were they getting it? The biggest number was through a state payment through their conservation district, but again, a lot through NRCS. And if you added those NRCS numbers together, they'd be the biggest total number. Fair number doing private company, and then again, some with the crop insurance rebate. We had a lot of responses from Iowa, where that's a popular program, I think, is part of the reason that number is pretty high. Next. Total years of incentive is interesting to see. Again, we had a lot of farmers with 10 years or more experience, but you can see not as many of them are still getting incentive payments. Now, sometimes that's because you sign up, you get a 3-year contract and it's over, or maybe a 5-year conservation stewardship program. But as I talk to farmers individually, what I find is they'll often sign up for an incentive to get started with a cover crop. Then once they get comfortable with it, they see the benefits, they'll just keep doing it on their own dime, so to speak. But clearly there are some farmers that have gotten more years, and sometimes that's because they're adding new fields. They may have had 3 years of a contract on one field, then they added another field, got a 3-year contract there. So it's not that they've been paid 6 continuous years on all their land. I would not take that away from this slide. Next. This was a big question. What happens after that cover crop payment ends? Do they just stop using them? Well, I think we clearly found out with this set of responses that that is not the case. We saw 67% said, I'm definitely going to continue with cover crops after the payments end. And another 23% said, probably, yes, I'll continue. So about 90% are saying definitely or probably I'm going to continue with cover crops after the payments end. So that's pretty striking and notable. That is the response. Next. Okay, just to kind of wrap up, we wanted to highlight some business opportunities we see for ag retailers. Some of you listening are probably engaged with these. Clearly, selling cover crop seed is getting increasingly common for our ag retail community. We're seeing many offer management advice on cover crops, including adjustments to fertility management. Seeding cover crops with high clearance rigs that maybe are sprayers most of the time, but adapted to seed the cover crop, or other broadcasting equipment such as fertilizer rigs is getting more common. And then obviously providing that cover crop termination service is another one. And finally, I think helping farmers monitor changes in soil health is an important opportunity for ag retailers through soil health testing services and interpreting those soil health tests. We will be doing a survey through CTIC on cover crop questions for the ag retail community. This will be the first time we've done this survey, so watch for that coming out in the next few months from CTIC. That's going to give us some important and helpful information as well. Next. So I think we're ready for the questions, and appreciate again the partnership with ARA to offer this webinar today. And I think if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. I see that there's a couple in the Q&A, I should say, is the place to put those questions, the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So I see a couple are here already. Here's a question: what new technologies are being introduced relative to cover crops and informing planting decisions for farmers? So Ryan or Andy, feel free to chime in on this too, but one I would quickly offer is the various regional cover crop councils have created cover crop decision tools. We have one for the Midwest, one for the Northeast, and one for the South, and the West will soon have these online free-to-use tools where a farmer can say, these are the crops I have or the management goals I have, and help pick out those cover crop species. So that's one type of tool that is out there. There are some of the seed companies that have management guidance as well on their websites. And then also there's a question on, are there technologies we can use with cover crops to understand the best region-specific varieties? So we have a new project that we're partnering with the American Seed Trade Association and other partners on through actually 38 scientists from 16 states are working on new cover crop varieties. And I'll just give you an example. We will soon have on the market new soft-seeded hairy vetch. You know anything about hairy vetch, it's unlike most of our cover crops, has hard seed. So when you plant it, although some of it germinates right away, you also get some that germinates a year later, some that germinates 3 years later, some 5 years later. It just keeps showing up in the field. So these new soft-seeded types will act more like a corn or soybean does, where it comes up when it's supposed to, and that's it. You're done with it. So that's an example. But yes, we're going to have new national cover crop variety testing with reports. Those will start to be available a year from now, because the first national cover crop variety test planning will be this fall across the U.S. So Ryan or Andy, you want to add any on those?
Yeah, Rob, thanks. I just add real quick from ASTA standpoint and remind folks that we just updated our website, the national map that shows the seed companies throughout the U.S. that produce seed. I'd recommend people look at that, reach out to people you may know on that list. They are focused on producing cover crop seed in a professional manner to make sure that they maximize germination, minimize weed content and things, and are working very closely with the regional cover crop seed groups that Rob mentioned in order to give good recommendations on what good mixes are appropriate for what regions. So betterseed.org under resources.
Ryan, the only other thing I would add, it's a little bit on the periphery, but I think related to this audience and the growing amount of cost share, as you alluded to, Rob, that's coming online or with other private sector, commitments will be coming online in the months and years ahead. And CTIC is working on a project with a host of other partners to bring in a clearinghouse app whereby farmers, agronomists, ag lenders, or others who want to better understand what cost share is available to them at a very ultra local level will be able to log into this much like you would, traveling to a city to look at what hotels or restaurants are available in that area. This is an app that'll be designed and hopefully live probably about a year from now. It's a fairly major lift, and it's not only just for cover crops, but all other conservation practices as well. So stay tuned for that in the coming year.
Well, while we wait for additional questions in the Q&A, and please feel free to type anything you have there. Ryan, I have a question for you. You farm part-time there in Iowa, as well as directing the Conservation Technology Information Center. And Iowa has a lot of the ag retailers that are quite active with cover crops. Maybe you could just share what you're seeing in your state in terms of the ag retail community's involvement with cover crops.
Thanks, Rob. I would maybe say a couple of things. One, with my farmer hat on, we are one of those farms that do rely heavily on our local ag retailer to provide that seeding service. We have the cereal rye in most cases. Once in a while, we add some oats, but use the cereal rye with our dry fertilizer spread and then incorporate it with a vertical till. And I've had great results with that at the rate of about a bushel an acre. Of course, wind comes into play on occasion, but the uniformity has been very good and really been happy. We're blessed the last couple of years, even though a lot of the state has been under fairly substantial drought conditions for Iowa standards. We've been fortunate to pick up some timely rains September, October, and get good germination in the fall. But on a broader sense, the Iowa Soybean Association, working with Iowa Ag Water Alliance and a host of other partners, has really worked hard to expand the technical capacity. And so you often hear reference to conservation agronomists that work side by side with their other agronomists at the retail location, somebody that has the both time and capacity and understands the nuances of the different programs and can go out and do additional consulting to farmers to help align what conservation practices or cover crop cost share they're interested in with what's available in real time. And that is a growing effort, not just in Iowa, but I would say across the Corn Belt, to have additional boots on the ground available to answer questions. And of course, all these programs have their own nuances, their own program eligibility requirements, and so forth. And so these additional technical resources really can be an invaluable partner in a farmer's journey as they choose to adopt these practices. And as you alluded to, have the knowledge, the expertise, along with the chance to go out and do the additional testing to find out what benefits are starting to accrue on those individual fields as the practices change. So some growing momentum in this area for sure.
So the next question was from Steve about information about good herbicide options for terminating cover crops. I've put a link both into the chat and the Q&A that is just one of several resources out there. This one happens to be from University of Missouri, where I'm based, so I'm familiar with it. Our weed extension specialist, Dr. Kevin Bradley, has done a lot of field testing of different herbicides. We find, for example, glyphosate, which works extremely well on things like the cereal grasses, rye, wheat, and so on, and also on brassicas. It does not work as well on legumes, so we find we often need to mix a broadleaf herbicide in there with glyphosate when we're trying to control clovers and vetches and so on. So he has some really good data on that, and again, I put that into the chat. There's also a question from Michael about the timing of termination of mixed cover crop species and how you look at that from an estimated nitrogen credit that the legume species could provide if they were allowed to grow longer. So, Michael, we had a different webinar we did a few weeks ago with a farmer and a farm advisor in Illinois, John Pike. That's a name maybe familiar to some in the Midwest. John used to work for University of Illinois Extension and farms himself, but also does a lot of education programs on cover crops and soil health. He's taken an interesting approach I've seen some others try, where they actually will go in and use a grass herbicide to terminate cereal rye or another winter cereal that is mixed with a legume. They terminate that winter cereal early in the spring and then allow that legume to continue to grow with less competition from the winter cereal. And then they'll plant green into that legume, such as a crimson clover, or depending where you're at, might be a different clover or legume. And I think that's kind of an interesting approach to maximize that nitrogen contribution of the legume. But the short answer is, if we're terminating those legumes early, before they've started flowering, probably it's going to be a pretty minor, or I should say modest nitrogen credit, maybe 50 pounds an acre or less, depending on how long it grew in the fall and obviously in the spring. If we can get that legume, by contrast to flowering, and maybe allow it to grow well into May, depending where we're at, then that's where we could potentially get that 100 pounds of nitrogen credit or more. But as you noted in your question, it's really dependent on the length of time that legume can grow. And there have been some estimates in various states. We do need more testing on that, but certainly the legumes can be helpful if they're just allowed to grow long enough. Ryan, do you have any experience on your end in using legumes in your own operation?
I have not incorporated legumes yet.
Okay,
so no
let's go to
direct
Dan's question. Will there be enough cover crop seed available if cover crops double in the next year or 5 years? Well, that's a big question for sure. And it's something that's been on ASTA's mind and many others. Andy, you want to take a first crack at that? And then maybe Ryan and I can check in as needed.
Yeah, Rob, thanks. And this is something that our companies have been working on diligently over the last probably 10 years as they go forward and anticipate increased use of cover crops. And we have all the confidence in the world that we'll have more than enough cover crop seed to cover significant increases in acres. And so we just recommend that both retailers as well as farmers continue to talk to their seed companies to make sure they understand their intentions. It's a lot like corn and bean acres. You want to make sure that you understand what those farmer intentions are as far out as possible so that you can plan for what's the desire is going to be out there.
Yeah, I'd second everything you said, Andy. I don't have anything to add. Ryan, you want to add anything to that?
It's exciting. It's a great problem to have. Great challenge.
Well, hey, thank you all for a great presentation today. They're all excellent questions. This is Richard with ARA. I did have one related to, and really comes to maybe Dan's question about increasing cover crops. EPA recently has a memorandum of understanding with USDA related to focus on mitigation efforts on the impact of pesticides on endangered species, and cover crops is one of those mitigation measures. So will that also play a major role in the expansion of cover crops use and dealing with those types of issues on trying to protect endangered species?
Well, I think it certainly could. Andy, you've probably been giving some thought to this with your staff. Any response that you have on that one?
Yeah, I would agree with you, Rob. I think it could as we look forward. We're still early on what the EPA's decision or EPA and USDA's decision or efforts are with respect to looking at endangered species and the benefit of cover crops. But as you look at that opportunity for the cover crop to mitigate some of the either nutrient remaining in the soil or other things that may remain in the soil, that could be a benefit to the ESA quotient quotient as they look at it from the standpoint of evaluation for EPA. So that's the most that we can get to at this point, Richard. I think it's still a little early to evaluate that too extensively.
Okay. No, thank you again. Thank you for a great presentation. This was really some valuable information. I do have on the slide right now up if you want to get continuing education credits. If you're unable to use the QR code there, please email Hunter Carpenter of ARA. It's at hunter@aradc.org with your first and last name, CCAs, or other information, and he'll get you in touch with the proper staff to try to get credits for those. We'll just switch to the last slide here. Again, we thank you for attending today's webinar. Thank you for those sponsoring CTIC, ASTA, CCAs, and North Central SAR, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. This webinar is being recorded today. Will be available for members to log in later on. To others within your companies, if they weren't able to participate today, can share. Also a reminder, there are some upcoming ARA webinars, one on March 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on FIFRA 101, an introduction to the complex landscape of pesticide laws and regulations with members of Faegre Drinker as presenters, a law firm that's a member of ARA. And on April 5th, 2024 at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, there will be a webinar on the Responsible Ag Federal Compliance Program, a voluntary program done with ARA and TFI in conjunction. We'll have the new auditor trainer as a presenter, Pete Muchler, who was formerly with CHS. He's a new trainer. So again, thank you for the presenters and the attendees today, and we hope you have a great rest of the afternoon.